Last time we talked about the two-level model of the psyche. We substantiated why we will use it when considering all the problems of personal development and detecting any glitches in the psyche. And then, already in the conversation, the question arose about the typology offered by classical psychology. Choleric, sanguine, phlegmatic and others, how relevant it is, and, most importantly, how useful it is. The reality is such that this typology, yes, it reflects something, but it's hardly absolute, at least for the simple reason that there are people who, depending on the circumstances, can behave like choleric people, like sanguine and phlegmatic people. And for them, this behavior is natural because the situation itself dictates the type in which the activity is most effectively carried out. And there are people who cannot pass from one type to another and give the basis for psychologists to build this typology. Although, in reality, this is about that frequency range, about the range of performance speed in which the psyche should work. So, apparently, its internal organization changes in some way during the transition from one type to another. What is interesting is that psychologists for several centuries have actually been ignoring other things that seem to be obvious. And understanding the interconnections of which does not seem to require colossal intellectual power. But, nevertheless, classical psychology ignores this. What is this? Let's look into the psyche of every one of us. We all belong to the biological species Homo sapiens. Belonging to the biological species means that every one of us has some kind of instinctive and unconditionally reflexive behavioral programs, both at the level of the organism and, say, nested levels, up to the cellular level of organelles in the cell. Because all this works and requires informational algorithmic support, and accordingly, there are some programs that ensure the functioning of all this, both separately and in interconnections that are normal for the organism. Here again, the question arises, what is normal? In addition to behavioral programs, which are purely innate in character, man, as one of the most highly developed biological species, also has a non-innate component of informational algorithmic support of his behavior. What does it include? First, we come into a world in which, in some way, a historical culture has taken shape. The culture of this or that people, of this or that social group, has its peculiarity, and when we grow up, we perceive from this culture certain patterns, templates of behavior. Moreover, we perceive them at the age when our personality has not yet been formed, the intellectual power leaves much to be desired, the awareness of life also leaves much to be desired. We simply perceive without pondering, and therefore we can say that culture, to one degree or another, to some extent carries a zombifying character. And we live in life, operating those automatisms of behavior in situations that are an external factor of impact, which the organism recognizes in some way and launches certain behavioral programs that are in culture. In addition, creative potential is inherent for man. And in those situations when man does not know the recipes for solving problems which may arise, are worked out in culture, either there are no such recipes in culture for some reason, then he can realize his creative potential, as a result of which a new vision of a certain problem will appear, and a recipe for solving this problem will appear. Either a new one, or one that already existed, but the recipe for it was somewhat different. How is creative potential realized? So it turns out that creative potential can be realized according to the principle, I do what I want, my way or the highway. That is, without any nravious ethical restrictions. Or it can be realized in line with certain nravious ethical restrictions. And if it is realized in line with certain nravious ethical restrictions, then there inevitably arises the question about the objectiveness of dobro and evil, as well as about the objectiveness of the difference between dobro and evil, about the source from which dobro flows, about the source from which evil flows, and differentiation between dobro and evil in life. In other words, questions arise in essence of a theological character, to which man, in one way or another, answers for himself. Let's assume that a person has grown. He is no longer a child but an adult, and to this or that degree, all these four components are developed in him. And then what happens in life? In life, situations are inevitable when the norms of behavior, stemming from the four named sources, are in fact mutually exclusive. And if they are mutually exclusive, and only one behavioral program can be realized in life and in behavior conflictlessly, then the question arises, what to give preference to? If preference in some situation is given to one, in another situation it's given to another, and so on, then statistics of preference arise. And we can talk about the dominance, that is, which of the sources dominates over some more or less long period of time. And then it turns out that the distinction into choleric, sanguine, and others is not very interesting. Because if preference in the majority of cases is given to instincts, then everything else is some kind of superstructure, a continuation of instinctive programs of behavior, their cultural shells. And then the question arises, how does an adult individual differ from a talking monkey if the behavior of the monkey is also subordinate to instincts? Further, if preference is given to the norms of culture in the form in which it has historically taken shape, what will happen? It is not like a monkey anymore. But the question arises, since culture, if we consider it as an informational algorithmic system, is limited, then situations in life also arise in which culture does not work. It requires the working out of some new behavioral programs, new recipes for interacting with the environment, solving problems, and everything else. But if creative potential is not sought after, or for some reason it's blocked, then what will happen? Another 10, 15, 20, 30 years will pass, and high tech will give us a humanoid robot programmed by culture, which, in most cases, in behavior, one cannot distinguish from a person. Not so long ago, one of the computer programs passed the Turing test. That is, about one-third of the experts, talking with this program on various themes, recognized it as a real Odessa teenager. What's missing? The only missing thing is the image of the physical carrier, which would have anthropomorphic features. And that's it. After that, you can send such a robot to work in a store as a consultant, and in most cases, it will cope with these duties. That is, it turns out that a cultured, so-called person is also not necessarily a human, since we cannot distinguish him from a robot. And if creative potential is realized, is this a human or not? Traditions of different nations also say that this is not a human, since there are sayings of the type, "Call not a human he who has not sophist nor shame." That is, if the creative potential is realized without any rabious ethical restrictions, then there takes shape a psychotype that can be called demonic. It is based on the principle, I do what I want. If someone does not agree, then prove to me that you are cooler. And if, realizing his creative potential, a person is faced with the fact that his knowledge, his capabilities are limited, correspondingly, in some situations, there arise unpredictable accompanying effects of his actions, which he evaluates as negative, which can be dangerous and can be simply murderous. Then the person is faced with the question of how to bring his limitedness into conflict-free harmony, into harmony with the unlimitedness of life. If man poses this question, then in fact he comes to the question of working out his personal religion, his system of personal interrelationship with God, and building his behavior in such a way that it lies in the stream of providence and is safe in relation to him and in relation to the world. So it turns out that there are four sources of behavioral programs. The fact that they exist should have been known to psychologists for at least the last 2 centuries. It is easy to guess that if one source dominates the behavior, then the type of behavior will be one. If another one dominates, then the behavior will be different. And accordingly, there are misconceptions about the vision of the fact that society consists of different psychotypes, which are characterized precisely by the priority of each of these sources. Western philosophy and the adjoining to it psychology, since the time of Plato, they have always been based on the fact that a human is a biped without feathers and with wide nails. So they are still based on this, and from this position they cannot be redirected anywhere. But in other cultures, this knowledge, although not in scientific terminology, it anyway existed. For example, Idris Shah cites a Sufi aphorism in one of his books. Not even an aphorism, but such an indication that a mixture of a pig, a dog, a devil, and a saint is a bad basis for a mind that wants to know life. It's not scientific, but what is it about? It's about the same thing. If you are interested in behavior, then a pig is an animal that lives on the basis of instincts, whose behavior, if we talk in modern terms, succumbs poorly to training and programming. Or you are not interested. A dog is also an animal. It also has instincts, but nonetheless, it lends itself to training, that is, programming, and performs the commands that it's taught, or automatically performs the tasks that it is also taught, guarding the territory. The devil is the first hierarch in the hierarchy of demons. Well, the saint in the understanding of the traditions of that era is an individual who is free from the power of passions, instincts, and any culturally conditioned claims, not a demon. And then it turns out that saintliness is the norm for a human. And what about Russian culture? Everyone knows the plot of the painting by Vaznetsov, Night at the Crossroads. If our contemporaries are asked to say what happens next, then, unfortunately, in the student audience, such a question causes a stupor, and at best, they recall about the journeys offered to the night. A complete set of journeys consists of 4 directions, and each of them is a certain test for the independence of the behavior of the knight from these or those sources. Let's see. You go there, you will be killed. What kind of test is this? This is a test as to whether he is subordinate to the instinct of self-preservation. Because if a promise is given that he will be killed, then the instinct of self-preservation says, why do you have to go there? He needs to go there in order to cleanse the territory from evil. But in order to cleanse the territory of evil, he must possess certain skills, in addition, be beyond the control of this very instinct of self-preservation. Next journey. You go there and you will be married. Who remembers what happens next? No. You will lose your horse. That's another journey. What about being married? Of course, subordination to sexual instincts. But the plot unfolds as follows. He goes in the indicated direction and finds a terem. Beautiful young ladies emerge from the terem. They take his weapon, lead him to a room where there is a feast. Next is a bedroom. He goes into the bedroom, lies down on the bed falls through, and he ends up in a basement. and from the basement he goes straight to the slave market, or he is dead. This variant does not work out when the knight has developed intuition. He sees the catch ahead of time, and therefore, as soon as the young ladies appear, he grabs them by the braids, and the young ladies go to the same bed, and they fall into the same basement. Everything is fine. Relevant? It is. In a number of armies of the world, in particular in the Israeli, in the Libyan armies under Gaddafi, there was a female special forces. And the sexual instincts teach what? They teach you that you can't beat a woman. You have to obey. So, in our time, it's really relevant. What is the next journey? You go there, you will be rich. He goes there, he comes to a city, and there is anarchy. They offer him to reign there, they offer wealth. What variance? He may accept the offer. What then? Then there will be work. Which Kipling described in one of his works with words similar to the following: there is no worse work than being a shepherd for fools. Because if the city already has anarchy, then this means that this is a consequence of its internal strife. They aren't able to form state power in such a way that would meet the social interest for the reason that either they themselves do not understand how to live like a human being, or there demons weave intrigues against each other, and accordingly, no power can resist until the demons are killed off. Accordingly, if he accepts the reign, he is doomed to perish in intrigues. If he does not accept the reign, then the guys are forced to solve their problems by themselves. And since the problems are solvable, then no troubles happen. The fourth journey. If you go there, you will lose your horse. He goes there. A wolf runs out of the forest, attacks. Then he says to the wolf, "Stop." The wolf says, agreed, understood, and that's it. And the wolf begins to serve the knight. To what does the last variant relate, and which of the journeys is the most significant? It really is. Although it seems, fine, the wolf will kill the horse, who cares? Well, the knight's horse is an expensive thing, but nonetheless, the loss is still recoverable. M. Lermontov has a poem, The Prophet, which has the following words: keeping the eternal covenant, the earthly creature is submissive to me. That is, the knight is not a professional tamer, the wolf is not from a circus. But according to the predetermination of the Almighty, the mission of man on earth is to be the successor of God, and accordingly, everything that's on earth must obey him. And accordingly, if the knight is the carrier of the human type of psyche structure, then the wolf resignedly agrees to serve him. The question arises, is this tale a fiction? Okay, this is a Russian folk tale. Let's turn to Europe. Read the life of Saint Francis. there is such an episode in the life of St. Francis. In the vicinity of one city, a wolf raged. It killed livestock, sometimes it killed people. The residents repeatedly intended to catch it, but somehow they did not succeed. Francis came. They complained to him about the problem. He says, all right. He went into the forest, found the wolf, brought him to the city, and concluded an agreement. The wolf does not kill anyone, lives in the city, and the people feed him, and that's it. And it was like this until the wolf died. On the same theme, recall the film The Taming of the Scoundrel with Adriano Celentano, one of the first. When one of his neighbor's farmers scatters poison across the field, and there are crows sitting on the tree. Celentano's approach to the question, who is your boss? Someone croaks. Celentano says, so there is an abandoned field many miles away. There is a lot of everything. Fly there. Got it? They got it. In other words, the theme about the relationship of man with the biosphere. It is precisely in the quality of the successor of the Almighty, whom everything must obey. It is present in different cultures, and it does not pass by. This is ineradicable. Now let's look at reality. The New York Times Magazine, in June 2005, published an article named Monkey Business, which described an experiment conducted at Yale University with Capuchin monkeys when they were taught how to use money, and they got, in general, everything that there is in modern Western society. When prices change, the conduct of the Capuchins is statistically indistinguishable from investors in the market. Racketeering arises, attempts at counterfeiting arise, there is prostitution, banditry, bribery, whatever you like. If to correlate with the history of the current global civilization, which is about 13,000 years old, if you count from the global catastrophe, as a result of which the past civilization collapsed, and the current civilization inherited freshly frozen mammoths in the permafrost of Yakutia. Yes, there is technological progress, but is there personal psychological progress? The reality is such that if we understand the difference of the types of psyche structure, then the progress of civilizations should be expressed in dynamics, statistics. That is, here is the hump of statistical distribution. If we put these four types of psyche structure on the abscissa axis, it should shift from the animal type of psyche structure towards the human type of psyche structure. When this information was first published, a number of comrades did not read this, but from someone's words, they learned that not all Homo sapiens are humans. As a result, accusations of racism arose, and they stated that the adherents of the conception divide people into human and subhuman. This reminds me of the saying, don't blame the mirror if your face is ugly, because the question arises, indeed, if among the adult population we detect the types of psyche structure, we see how they are realized, recalling our behavior in certain situations, we can describe ourselves as animal, demon, zombie, and rarely as human, with the possession of the fullness of human dignity. Then the question is, where does all this gradation come from? It comes from our childhood. Because if we talk about how man comes into the world, then, for example, a mosquito hatches from a larva, and from that moment, it is a full-fledged representative of its species. A person is born. What characterizes the biological species Homo sapiens? Precisely morphologically, that is, structurally anatomically. It is the ratio of the mass of the brain of an adult to the mass of the brain of an infant newborn, which is the highest in the biosphere of the planet. If we draw parallels, then a newborn baby, in terms of the level of bodily development, corresponds to approximately 50 to 60% of the pregnancy of other monkeys. So, from the point of view of a monkey, a human cub is a very, very premature infant. It turns out that if we analyze what happens in the future and how the development of man, an individual, takes place, precisely in the aspect of the formation of his psyche, then at the moment of birth, what is there? Only instincts and innate reflexes. What appears further? Further, the child develops and begins to adopt everything that he sees around. He does not think about whether this is good or bad. He simply does not know this yet. And due to the fact that the brain has not yet been fully formed, its intellect is also limited, and many things cannot be understood by him. These are the features of developmental psychology, since the organism is still developing, and not all structures that are necessary to support full-fledged intellectual activity have already developed in the organism. What does this lead to? Here is one of the definitions of alcoholism, which was given, if I'm not mistaken, by G.A. Shishko. Alcoholism does not start with the first drink. Alcoholism begins with the first glass that the child sees the parents drink. Further, the child is growing, so he masters some behavioral skills, adopts patterns of behavior from culture. Then the search for his mission in life begins. And the child tests the strength of the world around him, the psyche of parents, grandfathers, grandmothers, other children, and adults. There are no internal breaks at this stage of development. But the creative potential is realized, and it's realized precisely in the demonic version, that is, without any restrictions of an obvious ethical character. Then the child enters adolescence, and the sexual instincts wake up. Well, here a lot begins from which the parents are shocked. Why? Because the child used to be a good boy, but now he is no longer. And what to do with this no longer good boy is also not clear. Well, a certain number begins to think about the fact that the possibilities are limited, the creative potential is limited, and as a result of unlimitedness, conflicts arise with nature, technology, and with other people. Conflicts cause some damage, and one wants to live without constantly facing conflicts and the damage they cause. Questions of a religious character arise. And now, we live in a culture in which we are going along the path of personal development from childhood to adulthood, first in the mode of the educated and trained, and then some move into the mode of self-upbringing and self-education. The answer is as follows. The gradation of the adult population, according to the types of psyche structure, is the result of a cessation in personal development at some stage. And accordingly, if the overwhelming majority of the population does not achieve the human type of psyche structure, but still remains subordinate to instincts, which is characteristic of the animal type of psyche structure, or zombified by culture, or demonized according to their abilities, then this is the result of the fact that the cultures in which we live, other national confessional cultures carried by other peoples, other regional civilizations, all of them are equally defective because they don't allow children to completely go through the cycle of personal formation and achieve the level when the structure of the psyche becomes human. Moreover, here, it is also necessary to clarify that such a phenomenon as will is inherent to man. It is often said, power of will, freedom of will. People often use these terms, but they rarely delve into the content of the phenomenon, which is denoted by the word will. It can be defined in such a way that it is the ability of man to subjugate himself and the course of events around to the consciously perceived by him purpose consonance. How the will is realized is already another question. But this definition of will allows one to understand a great deal in the psychology of people, personal psychology and collective psychology alike. Let's look at this. If a person intensively does something, then very often it's thought of him, oh, what willpower he has. He pushes himself to do it. Well, let's see. If an individual is zombified to perform certain actions, then will he perform them? Yes, he will. And the fact that this is not will is indicated by a proverb that directly says, he works as if he is possessed. So if he is possessed, then he has no will of his own. There is someone else's will to which he is subordinate, or there are automatisms that work in an automatic mode, and will is excluded from the algorithmics of the psyche. The second circumstance is connected with the fact that will always acts from the level of consciousness. And in order for it to work, a conscious meaningfulness, a conscious purpose consonance of behavior is necessary. If a person is not able to make a choice, then will simply does not know the objectives for which it should work. And one of the ways to resolve conflicts is to drive the opponent into a stupor, to make him face two mutually exclusive objectives, the choice between which he cannot make, or there is one objective, but two recipes for its solution, its achievement. Until a certain purpose consonance is worked out, will cannot work. And in the language there is a saying, animal has impulse, human has will. The reality is such that if there is no will, then there is no human either. There is a specimen of the species Homo sapiens who either lives with an animal type of psyche structure or is programmed as an automaton and is factually a zombie. And now let's take a look at what goes on in the majority of our families. What do the parents want to achieve from the child first of all? Obedience. And if you've achieved obedience, then what? There is no will. Because will takes shape when the child shows his initiative and wants to achieve something. Yes, his initiative may not be directed at what the parents would like. But here we need to help the child grow up and make sure that his initiative is blago. Moreover, in early childhood, sophist and shame are not yet stifled, not repressed, and the child can distinguish between these things. He cannot intellectually comprehend this, because the intellect is not developed to the due measure. But nonetheless, what is dobro and what is evil, intuitively children very clearly determine. Therefore, if the child takes the initiative, then the responsibility of adults is to participate in this initiative, endowing it with the right directionality. And if the child takes initiative and is faced with inhibition, then there will be problems. For example, a child, a girl, at the age of 3, after her parents have put up new wallpaper in the living room, she decides that the wallpaper is not beautiful enough and needs to be decorated. She takes colored pencils and colors the wallpaper. Her parents come home from work and the child gets it in the neck. Now she's a 16-year-old girl, the memory remains, and she can remember that she was undeservedly and unfairly punished. They hurt her when she wanted to do what was best. To put it differently, if you are faced with the fact that the child thinks that the wallpaper is ugly and it's necessary to decorate it, then you need to take paints, pencils, and decorate the wallpaper with the child. Maybe in advance for this you need to stick white paper on the walls so that there's enough space for the fantasy to roam around. And if what might be called parental success in achieving obedience happens, what happens when the child becomes a teenager? Sexual instincts are awakened, and along with this, the instincts of herd pack behavior are awakened. All monkeys of the biosphere are divided into two categories. Some are herd pack, and others are familial. For example, gorillas are familial monkeys, and all sorts of macaques are herd pack. What are the differences? Those who live as a family, they have a lair, and they never defecate either in the lair or around it. They have a certain place, maybe more than one, but nonetheless it's away from the lair. But herd pack monkeys defecate where they run. In the biosphere, one of the functions of droppings and other excretions is to mark territory. Well, when there is a culture, Then instinctive programs have certain culturally conditioned shells and continuations. That is, it is understandable why the elevators are spray painted, the walls in the blocks of apartments, desks in universities and schools, everything is spray painted or has inscriptions. These are the cultural shells of instinctive programs to mark the territory of herd pack monkeys. If you look at what is painted there and what is written, this is done not thanks to a great mind. Let's put it this way. The bulk of what is depicted on desks in universities and schools is not from the greatness of mind, from the bounty of the soul, and not from the realization of creative potential. Another variant of cultural shells. We watch Western films, all sorts of their tales, scenes of initiation of knights. The character kneels in front of the suzerain, or a beautiful lady, and she lays a sword on his shoulder. In a herd of baboons, the hierarchy is built depending on who demonstrates his member to whom with impunity. But the essence of both processes, indeed, it is one and the same. I have laid my member on you, and you are obliged to serve me. The same thing. The cultural shell of the instinctive program that defines the hierarchy. Quotes from Russian chronicles. Two brothers, princes, are at war. Then they finish fighting. Boleslav, who has taken the city, denuded his brother's wife and thereby inflicted great humiliation on his brother. That is, he took the city, undressed his brother's wife in public, and showed everyone that he was the main baboon in the territory, and that it was he who himself decided which female belonged to whom. That is, there are grounds. Well, then, an article in Komsomolskaya Pravda newspaper. It's about the fact that psychologists worked with fishermen in the Far East region of our country, as a result of which the divorce rate in the families of fishermen fell. It turned out that in the men's team on board the trawler, in order for the situation to be minimally conflicting, the people avoided looking directly into each other's eyes. Because at the level of instinctive behavioral programs, this is a challenge on the theme, who is in charge? After the shift, they returned home. The habit, the skill of not looking into each other's eyes remained. When they came home, they also didn't look into the eyes of their wives. And according to the instinctive programs, if a man doesn't look, then he has fallen out of love. There were family quarrels. It was explained to the fishermen. Everything has to be fine on board. The situation should be conflict-free. And in order for everything to be good at home, you should look into the eyes of your wife. The statistics of divorces dropped. That is, the reality is such that whether we want it or not, this works. What's more, the language of gestures, the manner of behavior, is one of the languages of communication in the animal world. At the level of consciousness, we stopped perceiving it. But at the level of unconsciousness, unconscious levels, it works. For example, if around the table a large group of people has gathered, And you want this group of people to come to the opinion that you support and consider right. What needs to be done? If you want to show that you are the big boss, you need to treat them with food and give this food to them with your hands. Because unconsciously, instinctively, the one who gives food is in charge. If this function is performed by a waitress, then the boss is nobody. The decision will not be worked out. The group will not come to the opinion that the boss needs. But if the boss gives the food himself, then the conversation at the meal will flow in the direction that the boss needs. So this works. Now let's see what happens when you have obtained obedience from the child. The child has grown up. The sexual instincts and instincts of herd pack behavior have activated. How are most teenage crimes committed? The guys gather, they have strength, there is no need for mind. Energy is running over the edge. There are young ladies nearby. They have to show off in front of the young ladies. The young ladies are encouraging them because the cooler the better. The instincts of herd pack behavior begin to work. And as a result there is a serious crime, which no one wanted, but which was nevertheless committed. Why? Because there is no will. Instincts dominate. A collective egregor has formed. There is some kind of algorithmics in it. There is some purpose consonance of interaction between the surrounding world and this pack or herd. And off we go on the automatic mode. No one wants anything, but there is a serious crime. Who is guilty? The parents of all of them. Because in early childhood they achieved obedience, and the adolescents have no will. Because the will of man really manifests itself, at least in the culture in which we live, in our historical era, not at all in the fact that he chases himself to gym and buffs up there, or crams 3 foreign languages blind to the wide world. Will manifests itself in the fact that when instincts demand something inappropriate, or cultural norms require something inappropriate, then a human is able to say to himself, stop, and egress from the program in which he has found himself. And what inappropriate cultural norms do we have? Mainly 2, smoking and drinking. They drink like everyone else, smoke like everyone else, because being a black sheep in a collective where they drink and smoke is somehow not comfortable. And they cannot put themselves in relation to this collective in such a way that I don't drink or smoke, and I have the right to do that, but you don't, because you imitate those you consider adults and cool. So people can't do so, because they have no will. Instinctive programs of behavior. We are a 2-sex species. Some people think that we are 2 species, boys and girls. But nonetheless, we are a 2-sex biological species. What does this factually mean? This means that the instinctive programs of behavior in boys and girls are different. And the process of personal development of boys and girls is also different. Well, let's start first, not with personal development, but with adulthood. A child is born. He is not capable of a full independent life. until about the age of 2.5 to 3, until he enters the period when he begins to fully possess articulate speech. If his mother is not around, then these are big problems. Let's assume that the culture is at a 0 level of development. And, if viewed from the outside, the problem of automatic reproduction of the biological species in the continuity of generations should be solved. How should instinctive behavioral programs be organized? In fact, it's logical. If you were a programmer and were solving such a task, then the mother should be instinctively attached to the child, at least to the youngest child. And since she is busy with her child, she does not have time for everything else. A man should be instinctively attached to a woman and subordinated to her. And now we look at what is in the culture. Almost every nation has a saying of the type, "Nobody is a hero in front of his wife." And one of the most striking artistic expressions of this is the Soviet film, White Son of the Desert. You know what, guys? I won't give you the machine gun. Why? The wife forbids it. And if this is understood, then the image of customs immediately becomes not as attractive as it was viewed initially. Further, children grow up. They live in the same world as we do, and they also perceive everything. Grandma, tell my mother, you are her mother, so she must obey you. What? So the child has spotted the algorithmics. His mom must obey his grandmother. Further, the boy grows up and gets married. If he is the only one in the family, and the mother is still subordinate to her instincts, then, having become the husband of another woman, he still remains his mom's only beloved child. Maybe not even her favorite, but her own child. From the point of view of his young wife, this is her own husband, who must obey her and only her, because this is the norm of instinctive behavior. But this is one property of two owners. Therefore, the conflict arises, mother-in-law, daughter-in-law. And this is such a sharp conflict that there are no tales or anecdotes about it. And if it takes place, then both women alternately cry on the shoulder of the same man on the theme, "What does this vixen want from me? For what does she hate me so much?" And for nothing. It is simply that there is one property, but two owners cannot be equal in their rights. How can this conflict end as long as the instinctive programs are working? There are several variants. One of the women must prove that she is cooler and subjugate the other, or one of the women must expel the other from the family. What are the variants for resolving the conflict in a constructive way? At least one of the women must gain power over her instincts, and then everything falls into place. But a number of cultures are oriented on programming the resolution of this conflict in favor of the mother-in-law. Such is the Japanese culture. The same are the cultures of many peoples in the Caucasus. because the reality is such that the oldest woman in the family, relying on this whole complex of instincts, is also an egregorial leader in the ancestral egregor. Therefore, the role of women in the traditional cultures of the Caucasus, it is specifically peculiar. But this role is based on the instinctive behavioral programs for both sexes. One can argue about whether this is good or bad. In fact, it is good that this culture has ensured the reproduction of the population of these peoples in the continuity of generations over the centuries. What is bad is something different. What is bad is the fact that in these cultures, the question of the essence of man is not resolved. Because the question is not concluded in the fact that everyone has to obey the older woman in the family, but the question is concluded in the fact that everyone should be human. And if one understands what will is, and recognizes sovest as an innate religious sense, then a taken-place human is briefly defined in one phrase: a will subordinate to the dictatorship of sovest. If there is no will, then there is no human. If there is will, but no sovest, this is a demon. Also there is no human, but in a slightly different way. And our cultures, they are all such that the human type of psyche structure is achieved by few, and they become alien to society. The fate of Christ is an example. He is not needed by the elite, since he encumbers the carrying out of the regime of submission. And the crowd of ordinary people needs him as a Dobrius leader, whom they agree to obey. But they don't need him as a teacher who would reveal their problems, show solutions, help them with something. And in this respect, the other apostles are, in a sense, worse than Judas. He just went and betrayed, but these ones recognized him. And then the teaching that Christ brought was replaced by another teaching, with the connivance of the apostles. Now let's return to the question of the personal development of boys and girls. We will proceed from the fact that one and the same task is solved: the reproduction of generations of the biological species. And there is practically no culture. You are a programmer and are programming the solution to this problem. There are some dangers. There is a mother who is either pregnant or has a child. In what mode should the mother interact with dangers? Ideally, the mother should sense this danger from a distance of many kilometers and bypass it. Now let's take a look at how we grow. The fact that girls grow up bodily earlier is of no interest to us in relation to this problematics. We are interested in something else, that at a certain age, girls suddenly become smart, prudent. Not in the sense that they can explain everything, understand everything, or whatever, but in the sense that they do not look for trouble. They sense danger and don't look for trouble. At about the same age, boys begin to play with dangers. What stands behind these phenomena? Behind these phenomena, there stands the fact that the girl begins to master intuition, to sense danger, and to bypass it. She works out the skill of not falling into danger. Now imagine that the personal development of boys follow the same algorithmics. The boy senses danger and bypasses it at a distance of many kilometers. And what task is required from the boy? To hunt, this is one thing. And what he catches, this can offer some resistance. From the boy, something else is required. If the mother and child, nonetheless, find themselves under the impact of danger, he must ensure their withdrawal from the zone of danger to the zone of safety. And for this, he must have the skills of a meaningful volitional action in the face of danger. If the personal development of boys followed the principle of mastering intuition first, then the realization of these needs would be impossible. And so the boy, interacting with danger, learns to think, learns the skills of self-mastery, learns to be able to solve the tasks that are required of him in the all-encompassing task of ensuring the reproduction of the biological species in the continuity of generations in a dangerous environment. In almost every language, there are sayings such as, "Women are fools and men are jackasses," or "A man is strong in hindsight." Women do not drive badly. Women drive a car differently, because in the statistics of accidents, the proportion of women is not higher than the proportion of men. And in some cultures, it is lower, even when correlated with the proportion of drivers. They just drive differently. Jokes about blondes did not arise out of nowhere either, and this opinion that women are fools also did not arise from nowhere, because we live in a defective culture, and, having mastered the skill of avoiding danger, the girl stops in her personal development and does not master intellect. A story from the internet. A girl grows up in a family, her parents are smart, the girl gets a bad mark at school. Her mom is horrified, but it's her dad who must talk to her. Her dad's reaction? Not a big deal. The main thing is for her not to wear a veil back to front. Partly, her dad is right. But in the fact that her dad is right, this is followed by big consequences about which her dad apparently does not even guess. Why does her dad not guess this? Because in Russian folk tales, unlike those of Europe, the ideal of a woman is not Helen the Beautiful, but Vasilisa the Wise. That is, a girl in her personal development should not stop at the phase of mastering intuition. She must go further and master the intellectual power in order for the saying, "Women are fools," to become irrelevant. In the meantime, unfortunately, it is quite often relevant precisely in extraordinary, not routine everyday situations. 1956, North Atlantic. There is a collision of the Italian liner Andrea Doria and the Swedish liner Stockholm. The collision takes place at night. On the Andrea Doria, several people died, whose cabins fell on the destruction zone. On the Stockholm, seemingly no one died at all. The weather is generally good. Andrea Doria is sinking for a long time. There is time for a rescue operation, and when almost all the passengers are evacuated, the emergency party goes through the sinking ship on the theme of whether they have forgotten someone, whether they have lost someone. It is clear, emergency parties, these are men. And so somewhere on the lower decks, which are flooded with a mixture of ocean water and ship's fuel oil, they find a group of women in negligee. Since the collision took place at night, they ran out as they were in nightgowns. And what do you think happens? In general, there begins a woman's hysteria on the theme, "Go away, nasty, I'm naked." This is an indicator that the women grew up in a culture where they stopped in personal development at the stage preceding the development of intellect and skills of self-mastery. The men had developed the skills, therefore, grabbing the ladies under their arms. Despite their bites, scratching, and screaming, they dragged them all to the boat deck, put them in boats, and everyone was saved. And the second side of the question, men are jackasses. The man is strong in hindsight. Well, jackass, the metaphor is stubborn. So if he decides to do something, then the man is strong in hindsight. What is this about? This is about the fact that intuition is not developed. But after having made a great mess of things, the man is able to very clearly explain what should have been done and how, in order for everything to have been fine. This is the result of what? And this is the result of the very fact that he ceased in his personal development before he began to master intuition. And in fact, if the culture is normal, then the human type of psyche structure should be achieved by the beginning of adolescence. If the beginning of adolescence is considered the moment of the awakening of sexual instincts. That is, there must be a will, and the will must be subordinated to the dictatorship of Sovest. And accordingly, boys by this time must master intuition, that is, find it somewhere in there, in the depths of the psyche, and integrate it into the algorithmics for the working out of behavioral decisions and behavior. Well, girls, accordingly, must also achieve the human type of psyche structure and must master intellectual power in order to not only avoid dangers, but also to behave themselves accordingly. Further, one more circumstance is connected with instincts. Because the faunal laws, and the laws of the biosphere in general, are such that more specimens are always born than the capacity of the ecological niche allows. Then intraspecific competition begins. Weak specimens die or do not produce offspring for various reasons, and the strongest specimens are considered biologically fully fledged on the grounds that their ancestral lines continue. Now let's look at the history of civilization. There was a sociologist, economist, Malthus, who was the first to draw attention to the fact that the population grows faster than the growth of production, primarily of food products. That is, humanity has not taken place in the quality of humanness and reproduces on the basis of pan-biospheric laws. The birth rate is excessive in relation to the capacity of the ecological niche. As a result, there is a load on the natural environment. The response of the natural environment is epidemics and intrasocial conflict in the form of wars and crime. They may say, this is not typical for developed countries, in which, on the contrary, there is a demographic crisis, a problem with the birth rate, and so on and so forth. The reality is such that the way these so-called developed countries live is the other side of the same faunal laws. Why? Because if we look at the history of civilization, then the history of civilization is such that the birth rate in rural areas was always higher than in urban areas. And if we turn, for example, to the medieval archives of European cities, then we can trace the following pattern. A certain surname appears, it exists for 1 or 2 centuries, and then ceases to exist. And the reproduction of the urban population in history is not only the birth rate in the cities, but it's an influx of the rural population, which is excessive for employment in rural areas. Already in the 20th century, it became possible to correlate data of biology with these urban statistics. In the Soviet Union, there was such a geneticist, academician N.P. Dubinin. The personality is not entirely unambiguous, because there is a photo in which Lenin is with street children. Dubinin insisted that he is one of these homeless children, while others sarcastically mocked him about the fact that he was worming his way in with Lenin. Because in the conditions of the USSR, being close to Lenin ensured the solution to a number of problems. Whether this is so or not is not important in this case. What is important is that in 1944, in the city of Voronezh, Dubinin conducted a study of the populations of the fruit fly, Drosophila. Voronezh had just been liberated from the Nazi occupation. There was nothing in the city except for broken houses and carriageways. Studies showed that the fruit fly was genetically identical to populations living in rural areas. 2 years later, studies of the Drosophila population were repeated. In Voronezh, there was already some technosphere, transport was working, industry, and research showed that yes, the fruit fly had genetically changed. That is, the city is a powerful mutagenic environment. Politicians did not correlate Dubinin's research with how civilization lived, because our politicians grow from narrow, specialized people. The outlook is narrow, and if, for example, they master jurisprudence, then biology is not necessary. Finance is mastered, biology is not necessary. But the reality is such that the commercial efficiency of many types of activities in the city is significantly higher than outside the city. Why? Saving on transport costs, concentration of potential consumers, and by virtue of these circumstances, the city draws the population into itself the more intensively, the more industrial production is developed in society. As a result, in these so-called developed countries, up to 90% or more of the population are urban residents now. The fact is that in the city they degenerate, and this is expressed in the fact that developed countries are leading in the statistics of all psychic and other diseases. But there are also phenomena in which pan-biospheric objective laws are expressed. The regulation of the number of species within the ecological niche. If we live in a city and we constantly see a multitude of unfamiliar faces, then a signal goes into the species egregor about the fact that the ecological niche is overfull. What should be the biospheric response to signals of overfullness of the ecological niche? A decrease in the birth rate, it does exist. But besides this, there is a blocking of the mechanism of reproduction of the biological species. Hence the LGBT community, which no longer claims that it's a minority, but that it is the best of people. This is not culturally introduced. Culturally introduced is already a stratification on the biological component. Further, intraspecific competition intensifies. In the city, violent crime is the norm. But if we understand that the bulk of the population is made up of carriers of non-human types of psyche structure, then crime is ineradicable by force of the fact that this is intraspecific competition for a place in the sun, which stems from the pan-biospheric algorithmics for regulating the quantity of the biological species within the ecological niche. What have our wise politicians decided to do? To pull the entire population of Russia into 10 urban agglomerations. The question is, guys, did you study biology at school? Do you have brains? With what do you think and with whom do you work? It turns out that for carriers of the human type of psyche structure, by strength of these circumstances, plus finances that dominate society, the city as a place of residence is not attractive. A person can live in the city only by performing some kind of mission in line with providence. And experiencing discomfort, he in some way has to overcome it. And from this discomfort, he regularly has to go out into nature. Therefore, if you look at these facts, in most developed countries, including the urban population of Russia as well, in the last decade there has been a tendency, and it is gaining strength, on the theme of stopping living in the city and returning to life in nature, in some way preserving those developments of civilization that there are. In what is the difference when comparing our days with the Middle Ages? When there was no technogenic energy, and nonetheless, the city was still a mutagenic factor, in which the population could not reproduce in the continuity of generations biologically healthily. Only in the fact that the mutagenic impact of a modern city has increased many times over, and studies by Italian geneticists carried out on people show that working in a foundry, for the genetic mechanism to react with a mutation, 1 week is sufficient. Studies of Americans and Canadians show that urban children lag behind in IQ, intelligence quotient, by 3 to 5 points in juxtaposition with their peers in rural areas. In addition to that, studies by the British, which show that over the past 100 years, the average European has lost approximately between 3 and 8 points IQ. In different sources, different data. In other words, developed countries also show that pan-biospheric objective laws have not disappeared anywhere, and they still have a decisive impact on the life of modern society, no matter how equipped it is with the technosphere. Plus, you can add another culturally conditioned supplement to this. In nature, there are plants, there are substances that entering the human organism change the physiology in general and the physiology of higher nervous activity in particular. Under their impact, the world perception also changes, and the character of the work of the intellect changes. In the general case, such substances are called psychotropics. And in a particular case, these are all narcotics. In the Soviet state standards, alcohol was characterized as a drug. In the modern Russian standards, alcohol is not characterized as a narcotic, and the whole fight against drugs takes place aside from the fight against alcoholism and drunkenness. Drunkenness is normal, this is cultural drinking, this is permissible, this is normal. Even the Apostle Paul told people to drink wine and so on and so forth. But what remains hidden? The following remains hidden. About a third of the population carries a genetic predetermination for the fact that if alcohol becomes the norm in nutrition, then biochemical dependence and a need for alcohol, an insatiable addiction, arise, and they are simply doomed to become alcoholics. And not all people in whose families in the past there were drunkards are capable of saying, "We can't drink at all, because we had this in our family and we carry this," and culture is aimed to encourage it. Further, there is a genetically normal tuning for the biofields of the human organism. When psychotropics enter the organism, this genetically normal biofield tuning changes. We do not see auras, but cats and dogs do, and they react to sober and drunk people in different ways, including because they see the aura. The aura is different. When the world perception changes, then the information that should not be there gets into the psyche. That is why all alcoholics, when they get very drunk, describe their hallucinations almost the same way. To put it differently, this is a layer of reality that normally is closed for a person. It becomes open for the alcoholic by strength of the fact that he is under the influence of psychotropics. And furthermore, it becomes open to those who are traditionally described as saints, when they see much more than the average person sees, including the hidden aspects of reality. And in his own way, an outstanding politician was that shaman who hooked the Native Americans on tobacco. Why? Because when, under the impact of psychotropics, the world perception changes, and other channels of perception of information appear, then control over these channels can be established. And one can get into the psyche of those who are hooked or regularly take certain psychotropics. One can get into their psyche having certain skills and knowledge, exclude their will, if there is any, from the algorithmics of activity, or distort their will. And it's possible to subordinate all informational algorithmic resources that are in the psyche of that person through the egregor, or directly to the one who has the knowledge and skills that allow, through these specific channels, to enter the psyche of that person. Therefore, the legalization of marijuana, the propaganda that cultural drinking is normal, in fact, there are certain political forces behind this, for whom narcotics, including cultural drinking and so on, are an instrument of governance towards society, bypassing the control of consciousness of those who are manipulated.
Это поэтому англичане первым делом опиумные войны с Китаем начали, чтобы под контролем здесь?
Да.
Yes, this is the reason. And they began to import tobacco. This is really how it was. At the time of N.I. Pirogov, they used the same set of instruments in military field surgery, without intermediate sterilization. This was the norm. About a third of surgical patients survived. Now, to enter the surgery room, the procedure is long, lengthy, on the theme of antiseptics and everything else. This means that the result in certain types of activities is conditioned by the state of the one who is engaged in these activities or is going to be. There are some types of activities for engagement in which strict fasting, that is, water and nothing for some time, or water plus plant foods such as nuts, cereals. Moreover, outside the Jewish culture, one snickers at matzah. Since matzah is unleavened dough. But in relation to some types of activity, one should not snicker, because the physiology of the organism, under the influence of leavened products, can change in such a way that one can simply fail to enter into these types of activities, which ordinary culture attributes to the field of mysticism. That is, the question of what we eat and how we eat is far from being an idle question. Although every culture has its own norms and traditions, they have developed, they function, they are considered normal. But they are considered normal not because they allow the maximum realization of man's creative potential, but because they have developed and they are normal during the life of many generations. According to what people eat and what are the differences in national diets, medicine also characterizes the differences in the statistics of diseases that are characteristic of certain national cultures. Yes, man's genetics adapts to the nutrition in the continuity of generations. And therefore the transition from food of one's own national culture to the food of other national cultures cannot always be carried out and is not always safe. However, there are some interconnections between what we eat and how we feel. For example, Japanese medical statistics have responded to the introduction of broiler chickens into the Japanese nutrition with an increase in diabetes statistics. So there are certain problems that connect both the psychology and the physiology of the organism. So, having talked about how in modern civilization, despite the fact that non-human types of psyche structure dominate, and what this leads to, this in fact is more or less clear. But is an alternative to this possible? And what should it be like?
Кстати, вы сказали, что когда курицы появились, бройлерные у японцев, я когда маленький был, в больнице лежал, я смотрю, на столы накрывают нам кашу, там все это, там стол, там большие такие куски мяса. Я мелко говорю, я тоже хочу мясо. Они говорят, нет, это придут диабетики будут есть. И у них чисто мясо и овощи. То есть, в принципе, вы сказали причину, а они так и никогда и не вылечатся, получится. Что это же продукт отравления.
There is also such a fact. Ethnographers watched how the Papuans live. From their point of view, the Papuans have a negative protein balance. That is, more proteins are excreted from the organism than enters with food. Accordingly, the Papuans, as people, should, from their point of view, disappear. They involved physiologists and microbiologists in this. It turned out that the Papuans eat a local plant there. The plant is a habitat for some microbes. These microbes, entering into the human gastrointestinal tract, nitrogen that is in the air, plus the contents of the gastrointestinal tract, are processed into proteins, which replenish their protein balance. We forget that man is also a habitat for microflora and microfauna, and the process of assimilating food does not boil down to the fact that saliva, gastrointestinal juices do something. Both microflora and microfauna are involved in this. And among other things, our biofields are also involved in this. And biofields participate in such a way that there are known cases when people died from distilled water, which became poison.